Imagine standing in the heart of Ottawa, Canada's capital, in the early days of May. The air is filled with the scent of spring, and right before your eyes, stretching along the winding banks of Dow's Lake at Commissioners Park, is a sight that would make anyone hold their breath. A vibrant sea of color. More than 1 million tulips blooming in unison. Ribbons of crimson, bright yellow, deep purple, and soft pink stretch out to the horizon, swaying gently in the breeze like the soft waves of a floral ocean. Thousands of visitors from all over the world flock here. They crowd the pathways, cameras in hand, trying to capture the perfect shot. Children run and play among the flower beds, their laughter mingling with the morning sunlight. Couples hold hands, and occasionally you will catch the image of elderly veterans, chests heavy with medals, standing silently, their gaze fixed on those fragile petals. To most people, this is the Canadian Tulip Festival, the largest tulip festival in the world, a symbol of spring, a tourist destination, and a perfect backdrop for Instagram photos. But there is a curious thing here that few stop to ask. Why tulips? Why is Canada's national symbol the maple leaf, yet its capital is globally renowned for the flower symbolic of the Netherlands? And most importantly, why, amidst this vast forest of flowers, are there always special beds sent directly from across the Atlantic, crossing thousands of miles of ocean to be here, regularly and precisely like clockwork? The truth is, this isn't part of the Ottawa city gardening budget. Every single year, the Dutch royal family and the people of the Netherlands still send tens of thousands of tulip bulbs to Canada. They pack them with care, ship them across the ocean, and place them into Canadian hands. They did this last year. They are doing it this year, and they will continue to do it next year. This is a strange act if you truly reflect on it. In the world of modern diplomacy, where relationships are often measured by trade agreements, arms contracts, or geopolitical calculations, for a European nation to persistently gift flowers to a North American nation for nearly 80 years is unprecedented. It does not follow the rules of economic interest. It follows the rules of the heart. Because these flowers are not just plants. They are living witnesses. Every bulb buried in Ottawa soil is a thank you that has never ended. A gratitude rooted in the darkest years of human history, when the light of freedom seemed all but extinguished in Europe. But this story holds a painful paradox, a paradox we must decode to truly understand the weight of these petals. We know the Dutch love tulips, but history also records that at the absolute worst point of the war, this elegant flower became the only thing keeping the Dutch people from starving to death. They had to crush those precious bulbs, boiling them into a bitter soup just to survive the harsh winter. So why? Why would a people who once had to eat tulips in utter despair choose that very flower to gift to their saviors? Why didn't they choose a gift less reminiscent of trauma? And why, after nearly a century, when the soldiers of yesteryear have aged and passed on, when the children born in war have become grandparents, has the shipment of flowers from the Netherlands never stopped coming? To answer that question, we cannot stand in the Ottawa of the present, with its warm sun and peace. We must travel back in time. We must leave this brilliant sea of flowers to return to black and white footage, to a Europe in flames, and a Netherlands buckling under the boot of invasion. Before the darkness fell, the Netherlands was a picture of tranquility. It was a nation that prided itself on neutrality, a small but wealthy country of merchants, artists, and farmers. It was a land of windmills turning lazily in the breeze, of canals reflecting the peaceful sky, and of course, of tulips. For centuries, the Dutch had cultivated this flower, turning it into a global icon of beauty and prosperity. They believed that if they minded their own business, the storm gathering over Europe would pass them by. They were wrong. The illusion shattered in May 1940. It didn't take months. It took only 5 days. The German war machine, the Blitzkrieg, swept across the Dutch border with terrifying speed. The sky turned black with paratroopers, and the city of Rotterdam was leveled by bombers. Overwhelmed and outgunned, the Netherlands was forced to surrender. The occupation began. Freedom evaporated overnight. The vibrant colors of Dutch life were drained away, replaced by the gray uniformity of Nazi control. Radios were confiscated. Bicycles, the primary mode of transport, were stolen. Men were rounded up for forced labor. The Jewish population, neighbors and friends, began to disappear into the night. But the Dutch spirit was not easily broken. A resistance movement grew in the shadows, hiding pilots, forging documents, and whispering news of the outside world. But the true test of endurance, the moment that would scar the national soul forever, arrived 4 years later. It is a period etched in history as the Hunger Winter of 1944-45. By late 1944, the Allies were close. Hope was palpable. In an attempt to aid the approaching liberation forces, the Dutch government in exile ordered a national railway strike to cripple German transport. The strike was a heroic act of defiance, but the retaliation was brutal. The Nazi occupiers, in a fit of calculated cruelty, cut off all food and fuel shipments to the Western Netherlands. They turned off the heat, they turned off the light, and they locked the pantry. Then, nature turned against them too. The winter that year was one of the coldest on record. Canals froze solid. Gas and electricity were cut. In the freezing tenements of Amsterdam and The Hague, people burned their furniture, their books, and even the wooden blocks between the tram rails just to stay warm. But the cold was nothing compared to the hunger. Food stocks ran dry. Bread, butter, meat, they became distant memories. The daily ration plummeted to less than 400 calories a person. People were reduced to scavenging in trash cans. And when there was nothing left, when the gnawing pain in their stomachs became unbearable, they turned to the only thing they had in abundance, the tulip. It is a cruel and haunting irony. The flower that had brought the nation its golden age, the symbol of its wealth and culture, was now the last line of defense against starvation. Women would trek into the freezing fields, chipping away at the hard earth to dig up the tulip bulbs. They weren't food, they were survival. Back in the dark, unheated kitchens, they would peel the bulbs like onions. They had to be careful. The center of the bulb is poisonous and had to be removed. They would grate them, mash them, and boil them into a watery, bitter soup, or bake them into bread that felt like clay in the stomach. Eating them wasn't pleasant. They tasted metallic and bitter. They caused throat irritation and skin rashes. But they filled the void. For that terrible winter, the beautiful tulip became the food of the desperate. Tragically for many, even the tulips weren't enough. The Hunger Winter claimed the lives of approximately 18,000 to 22,000 Dutch people. Bodies lay in the streets because the living were too weak to bury them. The vibrant, proud nation was reduced to a skeleton, shivering in the dark, waiting for a savior. They needed a miracle. They needed an army that wouldn't just bring guns, but would bring bread. And far away, across the ocean, that army was preparing to move. But while the people starved, the heart of the Dutch nation, its royal family, was fighting a different kind of battle. A battle to protect the future of the monarchy itself, in a place that no one could have predicted. A hospital room in Ottawa, Canada. While the storm clouds of occupation darkened the skies over Europe, a very different story was unfolding across the Atlantic. To ensure the survival of the House of Orange, the Dutch royal family had made the difficult decision to split up. Queen Wilhelmina led the government in exile from London, but her heir, Princess Juliana, along with her 2 young daughters, was sent to the safety of Canada. They arrived in Ottawa, a city that must have felt like another planet compared to the war-torn streets of Europe. Here, there were no air raid sirens, no blackout curtains, no jackboots marching on the pavement. For a few brief years, the future Queen of the Netherlands lived a life of remarkable normalcy. She shopped at the local grocery store, stood in line like everyone else, and sent her children to a Canadian public school. The people of Ottawa didn't just host them, they adopted them. They respected their privacy and offered them a warmth that the princess would never forget. But in 1943, this quiet sanctuary faced a constitutional crisis that sounded like something out of a movie script. Princess Juliana was pregnant. Under normal circumstances, a royal birth is a cause for national celebration. But these were not normal circumstances. The laws of succession were rigid. For a child to remain in line for the Dutch throne, they needed to hold sole Dutch citizenship. But Canada operates under the law of jus soli, the law of the soil. Anyone born on Canadian territory is automatically a Canadian citizen. If the baby was born in Ottawa, the newborn prince or princess would technically hold dual nationality. This legal technicality could, in theory, strip the child of their right to the throne, creating a disastrous void in the royal lineage at a time when the Dutch people needed their monarchy as a symbol of hope more than ever. The princess was trapped by geography. She couldn't return to the occupied Netherlands, and she couldn't risk the succession by giving birth in Canada. So, the Canadian government did something extraordinary. They didn't change the law, they rewrote the map. In a move unprecedented in history, the Governor-General of Canada issued a special proclamation. The 4 walls of the maternity ward at the Ottawa Civic Hospital were declared extraterritorial. For the duration of the labor and birth, that single room ceased to be Canadian soil. It became, legally and spiritually, a tiny, sovereign island of the Netherlands in the middle of North America. Canadian sovereignty simply stepped back to let a new life enter the world safely. On January 19, 1943, Princess Margaret Francisca was born. She was the first, and remains the only, royal baby ever born in North America. Her name, Margaret, was chosen carefully. It refers to the marguerite, or oxeye daisy, a flower that was wearing a symbol of resistance in the Netherlands, worn by patriots to show loyalty to the royal house. The news traveled fast. When word reached the occupied Netherlands via secret radio broadcasts, it sparked a wave of quiet jubilation. It was a sign that the lineage was secure, that the Nazis had not won. Back in Ottawa, the celebration was public and loud. For the first time in history, the Canadian flag on the Peace Tower of Parliament was lowered, and the Dutch tricolour was raised in its place. The bells of the Peace Tower rang out Dutch melodies, their sound drifting over the city that had become a cradle for a foreign king in waiting. But as Princess Juliana held her newborn daughter in the safety of that international hospital room, her joy was tinged with a heavy burden. She knew that while her baby slept in a warm crib, thousands of Dutch babies were crying in the cold. She knew that while Canadians were cheering for her, they were also preparing to die for her country. The debt of gratitude was growing, and soon the soldiers of the nation that had sheltered the princess would be called upon to save her people. While the new princess slept safely in Ottawa, the sons of Canada were fighting through the mud and blood of Europe to reach her people. By late 1944 and early 1945, the 1st Canadian Army was given a task that many considered impossible. They were to clear the northern flank of the Allied line, pushing through flooded lowlands and heavily fortified German positions to liberate the Netherlands. It was a brutal, grinding campaign. They fought not just the enemy, but the terrain itself. Dikes that had been breached, fields turned into swamps, and bitter, bone-chilling cold. But as the Canadian tanks rolled into the western Netherlands in the dying days of the war, they didn't just bring firepower, they brought life. For the Dutch people, emerging from the horrors of the hunger winter, The sight of a Canadian uniform wasn't just a political change, it was a divine intervention. These soldiers were witnessing a humanitarian catastrophe. They found a population that had been reduced to shadows. Men and women with hollow eyes and skeletal frames, children who had stopped growing because they had nothing to eat but tulip bulbs. The soldiers did what any human would do. They stopped fighting and started feeding. History records this as Operation Manna. In a surreal twist of warfare, Allied bombers, the same machines designed to level cities, were loaded with a different payload. They flew low over the starving cities of Rotterdam and The Hague, opening their bay doors. But instead of high explosives, they dropped sacks of flour, crates of dried eggs, chocolate, and tins of meat. Down below, the Dutch people looked up in terror, expecting death, only to see food falling from the sky. They ran to the rooftops, frantically painting messages in white paint, large enough for the pilots to see. 3 simple words that would define a century of friendship. Thank you, Canadians. On the ground, the scenes were even more visceral. Veterans recall the moment they entered the liberated towns. They were swarmed, not by an angry mob, but by a sea of orange. People climbed onto the tanks, weeping, laughing, kissing the dusty faces of the soldiers. Hardened infantrymen, who had seen the worst of humanity for years, broke down in tears as they handed out their own rations, chocolate bars, cigarettes, dried biscuits, to starving children who had never tasted sugar in their lives. For a brief, shining moment, the horror of World War II was replaced by pure, unadulterated euphoria. But this freedom was bought at a terrible price. We cannot tell the story of the Tulips without telling the story of the graves. More than 7,600 Canadians died liberating the Netherlands. They were young men from the prairies of Saskatchewan, the fishing villages of Nova Scotia, and the streets of Toronto. They came to a land they did not know, to fight for people they had never met, and they never came home. Today, in places like Holton and Grosbeek, there are thousands of white headstones standing in perfect rows. These are pieces of Canada in Dutch soil. And if you visit these cemeteries today, you will notice something profound. They are immaculate. For 80 years, local Dutch schoolchildren have tended to these graves. Families adopt them, bringing flowers on Christmas and birthdays, ensuring that their Canadian soldier is never forgotten. This is the dual debt that Princess Juliana faced when she finally returned home in May 1945. She returned to a country that was free but broken. She saw the starving faces that were filling out again thanks to Canadian food. She saw the fresh graves of the men who had died to open the door for her return. She realized that the bond between her country and Canada was no longer just about diplomatic protocol or royal hospitality. It was forged in blood and sealed with bread. It was a bond between a mother who was given shelter and a nation that was given life. And so, as she looked out over her liberated but scarred kingdom, Juliana knew that a simple letter of thanks would not be enough. She needed a gesture that was alive, something that would return year after year, just like the memory of the liberation. She thought of the flower that had kept her people alive in the darkness, and she decided to send it back as a symbol of the light. The war ended in May 1945. The silence that fell over Europe was the silence of exhaustion. The Netherlands was free, but it was physically and economically shattered. Cities lay in ruin, infrastructure was destroyed, and the soil itself was scarred by salt water and explosives. In such a landscape of devastation, where every resource was precious and rebuilding was the only priority, you would expect a nation to hoard its assets. But Princess Juliana did the opposite. In the autumn of 1945, barely months after the Germans surrendered, a massive shipment arrived at the docks of Ottawa. It wasn't machinery, it wasn't money. It was 100,000 tulip bulbs. This was a gesture of staggering generosity. Remember, just one winter prior, these bulbs were being eaten to stave off death. Now, they were being sent across the ocean not as food, but as a symbol of resurrection. It was the royal family's way of saying that the darkness had truly passed, and that beauty was allowed to exist again. The Canadians planted them, and when spring arrived in 1946, the capital city erupted in a riot of color that it had never seen before. But Juliana realized that a one-time gift, no matter how large, would eventually fade. Memories are short, and history has a way of being forgotten as new generations rise. She wanted the bond between Canada and the Netherlands to be living, breathing, and perennial. So, in 1946, she made a promise that would outlive her. She sent another shipment, 20,500 bulbs this time, with a specific request. She asked that a portion of them be planted right at the Ottawa Civic Hospital, so that the flowers would bloom every spring outside the very window of the room where her daughter was born. Along with this shipment came a pledge. The Dutch royal family would send 10,000 bulbs to Ottawa every single year, for as long as they lived. It was a contract of friendship, signed not with ink, but with roots. The Dutch bulb growers, moved by their princess's gesture and their own gratitude for the liberation, decided they would not be left out. The Dutch Growers Association matched the gift. And so, the annual tradition was set. 10,000 from the palace, 10,000 from the people. 20,000 flowers arriving every autumn like clockwork. For the first few years, Ottawa simply enjoyed the view. But the flowers kept coming. They multiplied. The display grew more spectacular with each passing season. It took the eye of a visionary photographer named Malak Karsh to realize that this was more than just gardening. It was a phenomenon. Karsh, whose brother was the famous portrait photographer Yusuf Karsh, famously said that he had unlimited inspiration from the tulips. He lobbied the local board of trade, arguing that this unique diplomatic treasure should be celebrated. In 1953, his vision became reality. The first Canadian Tulip Festival was held. It started small, a local celebration of spring, but the story behind the flowers was too powerful to stay local. Over the decades, it exploded into the largest tulip festival on the planet, rivaling even those in the Netherlands itself. It became a pilgrimage site. The royal connection remained the festival's beating heart. In 1967, during Canada's centennial year, Queen Juliana returned. She didn't come as a refugee this time, but as a monarch, standing on the soil that had sheltered her, surrounded by the blooms of her gratitude. Decades later, in 2002, the cycle came full circle. Princess Margriet, the baby born in the International Hospital room, returned to Ottawa to celebrate the festival's 50th anniversary. She walked among the flowers that were, in a poetic sense, her siblings, both born of the same wartime struggle. And the tradition continues to evolve, finding new ways to speak to the present. In 2020, to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation, the Netherlands didn't just send the usual amount. They launched the Liberation 75 campaign. Their goal was monumental: to plant 1.1 million tulips across Canada, one for every single Canadian who served during the Second World War. From a desperate meal in a freezing winter to 1 million blooms across a continent, the tulip had completed its transformation. It was no longer just a flower. It had become a living monument. But this brings us back to the question we started with. Why continue? The war is ancient history to the TikTok generation. The veterans are almost all gone. Why do the Dutch still feel this intense need to send these flowers? And why do Canadians still flock to see them with such reverence? The answer lies not in the past, but in what these flowers mean for the future. Why does the Netherlands still do it? It has been nearly 80 years. The generation that suffered through the hunger winter is fading into the pages of history. The young soldiers who stormed the dikes are now great-grandfathers, or names etched on white stones. In a fast-paced world where alliances shift like sand, and historical memory is often measured in news cycles, why does a modern European nation continue to send a shipment of perishable bulbs across the Atlantic, year after relentless year? The answer is simple, yet profound. It is because true gratitude is not a transaction. It is not a debt that you pay off once and receive a receipt for. It is a continuous act of remembrance. For the Dutch people, the arrival of spring is inextricably linked to the arrival of Canadians. You cannot separate the two. To stop sending the tulips would be to admit that the memory has faded, that the sacrifice of those 7,600 Canadian boys has become less relevant with time. And that is something the Netherlands refuses to do. These flowers have become a ritual of memory. Much like the poppy is worn in November to remember the fallen, the tulip blooms in May to celebrate the living. But there is a crucial difference. Stone monuments stand still. They weather and age. Flowers are alive. They die and they return. Every spring, when the green shoots break through the thawing Ottawa soil, it is a biological reenactment of the liberation. It is life returning after a long, hard winter. It forces every new generation to ask the question, why are they here? And in answering that question, the story of the sacrifice is passed down to the young. This tradition has also evolved into a unique form of flower diplomacy. In international relations, this is what experts call soft power. But to the people involved, it feels more like family. It keeps the bond between Canada and the Netherlands uniquely tight. It's why prime ministers and royals still visit each other, not just as allies, but as kin. It's why, when you walk through the streets of Ottawa today, you will see the Liberation 75 tulip, a bright orange solar flare of a flower, growing in schoolyards and private gardens. It teaches the youth a powerful lesson. When a Canadian child asks their teacher, "Why are there so many tulips?" they aren't just told about botany. They are told about a princess who needed a home. They are told about a starving child who needed bread. And they are told about a soldier who left the safety of his home to fight for the freedom of a stranger. It transforms the abstract concept of freedom into something you can see, touch, and smell. So, let us return to where we began, back to Commissioner's Park by Dow's Lake. The sun is setting now, casting a golden glow over the endless rows of red, yellow, and orange. The crowds are thinning out. Near the water's edge, an old man stands. He is wearing a Legion beret. He reaches out, his trembling hand brushing the velvety petal of a single orange tulip. He remembers the mud. He remembers the cold. He remembers the cheering crowds in 1945. A few feet away, a young family of tourists is speaking Dutch. They stop. They see the veteran. They don't know his name. He doesn't know theirs. But they see the way he looks at the flower, their national flower. The father nods to the veteran. The veteran nods back. No words are exchanged. No words are needed. The flower has already said everything. This is why the ships still cross the ocean. This is why the bulbs are still planted. Because some debts can never be fully repaid, but they can be remembered, beautifully, vibrantly, and eternally. As long as the tulips bloom in Ottawa, the world will know. Canada saved the Netherlands, and the Netherlands will never, ever forget.